in 2020. And well, you all know what happened. So unfortunately, part of the deal was I had to appear in person to launch the book in Europe, and COVID hit, and it wound up going on the back burner a little bit, but gave me more time to polish the book up. Some more movies came out, so it kept getting updated, and thankfully we got it out just in time last year to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the very first vampire feature film, which is Nosferatu. For those who don't know, Nosferatu was kind of the right here, Nosferatu, if you can see it. And Nosferatu was an unauthorized silent version of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is made now 101 years old, made in Germany by a filmmaker, F.W. Murnau, who is one of the all-time great silent directors. If you have ever read the book Dracula, you know that it has never really been filmed very accurately. People always sort of pick and choose bits of it, but no one's ever really shot the book start to finish. This was too close for comfort, though, and so Bram Stoker's widow sued them for plagiarism and ordered that all prints had to be destroyed. Luckily, that was not enforceable, and the film, of course, has since survived and flourished, and it's now a classic. It's more like the first half is kind of similar to Dracula. They just change the names around, and then it goes on to its other kind of it goes off its own path, shall we say. The ending is extremely different. But in the course of writing this book, the format is that there's sort of a long intro about sort of the literary and mythological antecedents of vampires, who, I mean, they go back all the way to Greek mythology. Even if you look at the Apocrypha of the Bible, you have the story of Lilith, for example. It's really been with us in just about every single major world culture for centuries. But it really obviously took off with Dracula at the very end of the 19th century, which is sort of like, ground zero for, what we have now. So now that we have basically 100 years of vampire films under our belt, what is interesting is just that how different it is from one country to the other. And watching, especially rewatching a lot of these films, some I hadn't seen in a long time, it was interesting to see how different cultures interpret them. For example, in the UK, you have, the Hammer Gothic films are the ones that we all think of, but they've also done some more modern ones. In Hong Kong, of course, they have the hopping vampire movies, which I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure of seeing one, but it's a whole different interpretation of the vampire where it's all based around they can be stopped by Taoist prayers instead of crosses, but the vampires all hop after you instead of like coming after you, instead of like skulking into your bedroom. But it's a whole different kind of take, and there's dozens and dozens of these movies as well. So it's just really fun to kind of see how it evolved. And the format of the book is, so like I said, you have this long intro here where you kind of lay out all the groundwork of all, and some, for example, some films and TV shows that have vampires in them that may not actually be full-on vampire projects, stuff like American Horror Story. More recently, there was a mini series on Netflix called Midnight Mass, which is wonderful. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend checking it out. It's really wonderful. It's like just reading a really great, long, juicy book. It actually captures that feeling by a guy named Mike Flanagan, who does some really, really great horror stuff. Has a new show starting tomorrow, as a matter of fact. And then following that, we have write-ups of 200 significant vampire movies, ones that I thought really had something in particular to offer to that particular subgenre, if we want to call it that. Not necessarily the 200 best, because some of them are terrible but interesting. The worst of them being one called Die Hard Dracula, which is one of the worst films ever made, but it's hysterically funny. If you ever see it pop up, it's you will not be bored. But these are all sort of films that have just a little quirk. Some are indies, some are major studio films, and you'll also notice that by decade it also, of course, evolves. Of course, you've got in the 30s you have the Bela Lugosi Dracula is the big Kahuna. And then as you start to get into the middle of the century, like around the late 50s, that's when Europe really becomes a major player. Italy, for example, really jumped on board starting in 1960 and just went nuts. They made their own vampire movies like crazy. Japan made a lot of them, of course. And of course, as the vampire really reevaluated itself, like when Anne Rice came on board with Interview with the Vampire. So by the late 70s, you really had sort of the vampire as this sort of sexy figure of the night as we know it today. That's something that Bela Lugosi, of course, had started when he played Dracula on stage and on film. But it was really with Anne Rice where the vampire went from being this sort of, creepy, disgusting predator that would come after you if you weren't careful and weren't religious and, took caution and watch after your kids, And then it became this kind of thing where it's like people sort of wanted to be vampires. They wanted to be like Louis and Lestat, and that's when you had this shift as well in films. Like by 1979, you had this flood of vampire movies all of a sudden. It was like probably the busiest single year for vampires ever. TV miniseries, shows, movies, you name it. You had a really big budget version of Dracula with Frank Langella and Laurence Olivier, which again takes major liberties with the book, obviously, but it's still, I think, a very fine adaptation. You got things like Salem's Lot, the miniseries, which is based on Stephen King's book, which has since been filmed and sequelized many, many, many times. I think that is now, since along with Interview the Vampire and Dracula, that's probably one of the very biggest vampire novels of the past century. And so by the 70s, like I said, it really evolved. That was kind of, when disco died and the vampire sort of helped usher in the 80s. And that's when the sort of the sexy vampire, it stopped becoming more about like, women in low cut gowns, which we saw like in the 60s and 70s. That was something familiar, but that really stopped around that time. And it became more equal opportunity. You started to have, again, because of Anne Rice, you started to have more that the male vampire was also this sort of object of fear and desire, along with the female vampire. Oddly enough, if you paid it for a run in the 70s, for example, one huge thing that was popular was the lesbian vampire, which Hammer really exploited, and things like the Vampire Lovers and Lust for the Vampire, Twins of Evil. And that was, of course, their version of Carmilla, which was a novella by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, which was roughly a little bit before Dracula, but it really took a while to be filmed. But since then, we've had lots and lots of adaptations of it. And so for a while, we had this sort of this lesbian vampire thing going on. But then it changed. And so then starting in the 80s, it was more about 50-50. It was about equal opportunity objectification for vampires. And you started having female directors coming in. One of my very favorite vampire films of all time is called Near Dark, which was one of the very first films directed by Catherine Bigelow, who of course went on to make history. She was the first woman to win an Oscar for directing for The Hurt Locker. This is way before that, though. She recruited several cast members from Aliens, which had been directed by her beau at the time, James Cameron. And she came up with this whole new twist on vampire films. It's set in the American Southwest. It's about a young man who's just kind of a farm boy, and he winds up getting accidentally initiated into this sort of nomadic band of vampires who go around in a trailer and just, feeding on people at bars and things like that. But it's very much sort of a look at vampirism sort of flourishing, in the middle of America, just as in normal blue collar workers, and how it just kind of can seep in there and nobody can notice it, and about the tensions that evolve in this clan. Some of them have been around since the Civil War. Some of them are still fresh, and he has to figure out, does he want to go down this route or not? So again, I think after Near Dark, for example, was a pretty big one. And so you kind of sort of see how vampires go in and out over the decades. Like I said, it's curious, because if you look at the very origins of the vampire, it was just a very cautionary tale. Dracula was a foreigner. He was from Romania. He was a guy who got on a boat and made his way over to the UK, where he had some real estate that he set up in London, and he brings pestilence, he brings rats. It's something to be feared. It's an outsider who's coming after you. And you can sort of see how those anxieties change over the years. Sometimes the vampire becomes funny. Sometimes it can sort of be seen as sort of the equivalent of VD, which again was a major concern in Victorian London. There was this sort of anxiety about sexuality that Dracula really cashed in on. And you still see that today with a lot of vampire stories that are being told. More recently, for example, one of the best vampire films, and they since made a TV series out of it for one season, is Let the Right One In, which is a really excellent Swedish film, which is about a young girl who has been eternally a vampire for a very, very long period of time. And she has an older male helper. And she moves into this apartment, and a young boy winds up moving, who lives next door to her, becomes intrigued by her. And he's being bullied at school, and this kind of unusual friendship forms between them, and takes some very dark and twisted turns. But I think that's a good example of how, in the more modern setting, how the vampire can take on this form of how right now there's all this concern about children and their welfare and things like that, and about how a young boy who is being subjected to bullying winds up sort of falling under the sway of this vampire kind of spell, you might say. And it has sort of a very ironic sort of tragiromantic ending. just to spoil it, but that he winds up essentially becoming her next keeper. Last time you see them is, they're on a train and he's watching over her coffin and they're doing little more signals to each other. Um, so it's I know a lot now. Of course, we sort of have this image of vampires as being sort of something sort of vaguely cheesy, because of things like you've got like Count Chocula and things like that. And it can be fun. I mean, there is a there's certainly a lot of comedy to be mined out of vampires, of course. I mean, for example, we all know this guy right here. Uh, so if you grew up watching Sesame Street, that's probably a lot for a lot of us. That was our first exposure to the vampire. It's like a one, a two. Of course, they didn't really deal with the whole blood-sucking aspect, but it's just we all grew up with that image of the cape and the fangs and the widow's peak. Um, and again, it's almost like we kind of feel like it's our buddy. A lot of us so-called monster kids, like there's a certain level of affection, and the vampire, I think, has really has evolved, I think, to grow along with that. You'll notice, especially since 80s kids, this Generation Zers, for example, really fell in love with sort of vampires growing up. And that's why I think we still have so many vampire stories being told every year. We have more and more films, more and more miniseries, especially when streaming is hit. I mean, you can't even keep track of it. When I was trying to narrow down for the book, just for things from the last couple of years, I mean, it was insane. There was just actually just an absolute flood of stuff out there, from all over the world. For example, there's a really interesting one called Blood Red Sky, which is a German UK co-production, which is on Netflix right now, which is about a vampire wind up infecting this woman who's been infected with vampirism. She's trying to fly and get a cure with her son on a plane, and it winds, of course, turning into like a vampire free for all on a flight that's going transatlantic. So there's all kinds of material to be mined from this that hasn't been done yet. And of course, you've also got the whole gender politics aspect, which is something that especially since Me Too, for example, has changed the way we talk about this, and vampire films have really kept up with that. There's a film, for example, called Jacob's Wife that came out in 2021, which is also streaming and worth checking out. But that's about a pastor whose wife winds up being turned into a vampire, and it winds up turning into basically like a vampire version of War of the Roses. Like there's this whole tension between the two of them because she's not entirely on board with his dogma anyway, and that it's almost like a comedy of manners between this married couple and what happens when vampirism gets thrown into the mix. But it's that's a really, really funny one as well. Um, and also, the question, of course, is like what actually defines a vampire movie, and that was a tough one that I had to wrestle with this book, because there are certain films where they'll either say the word vampire, but I don't think it really qualifies. The very first major hit European vampire film to come out of Italy, for example, some would argue is one called Black Sunday, which is one that has been copied many, many times. Tim Burton, for example, has dropped overt nods to it in a lot of his films, like Sleepy Hollow, with an actress named Barbara Steele. And I included it here because I put it in the intro, and there's a little spoken word at the beginning of the movie which actually calls her a vampire, but she's really not. She's more of a cross between a witch and a zombie. She doesn't have fangs, she doesn't actually drink blood, but she sort of feeds on a life force. So it's kind of vampire adjacent. And there are a lot of these movies where I kind of had to think about how close do you want to get to what constitutes a vampire. And again, it's tricky. Like, do they have to have fangs? Do they actually have to die first? And because a lot of films sort of play fast and loose with those rules. And then of course there's the rules about what fights off a vampire. Is it a stake through the heart? Is it beheading? Is it can a silver kill them? For example, because in some stories of vampire lore, if you shoot one with a silver bullet, like a werewolf, that will kill them, and other ones it doesn't. And I've actually had to sit down with friends where I explain to them, like, just because you see one vampire movie with a certain set of rules, that doesn't mean the other movies are going to follow that too. We have tons of vampire movies where they walk outside in broad daylight. That's a really common thing. It always confuses people. There's one called The Hunger, for example, with Susan Sarandon and David Bowie and Catherine Deneuve, which is a wonderfully stylish 80s vampire film directed by Tony Scott. It's kind of right at the cusp of when music videos were starting to kick in. But it's so much fun. But they never say the word vampire. It is all about the fact that they have this genetic condition that they can pass on through sharing blood, where they just live forever. Well, at least some of them do. David Bowie's been living for centuries, and when his biological clock starts to suddenly accelerate, and he starts to age, and he seeks help to figure out what's going on. But it doesn't play by those rules. It has nothing to do with crosses. They wear a little Egyptian onyx, for example, around their necks. So their culture goes way back pre-Christian. But they walk around in broad daylight. And again, we call it a vampire film, even though, like I said, it doesn't quite fall into that, but I still think it is a vampire film, and it spawned a whole TV series after that where it is much more explicitly about vampirism. But that's a good example of how something can be a vampire film in attitude, if not necessarily in practice. And of course, since this talk is, being done for a library, I've just got to go back and say a lot of these are, based on literature. The Hunger was based on a book by Whitley Strieber. Like I said, Carmilla and Dracula, of course, are the big literary ones. But again, Anne Rice has been adapted multiple times. Obviously, the big one is the film of Interview with the Vampire by Neil Jordan, which was shockingly faithful to the book. If you ever read the book, especially when it first came out when I was a kid, I read it back in the late 80s. And I thought, because they've been trying to make a movie of this thing forever. I mean, it took a long, long time to get it made. And I thought, there's no way they're going to film this book because, first of all, it has kind of like what was at the time in the 80s would have been a very sort of a dicey kind of relationship between the two male vampires who are at the center of it, Louis and Lestat. And you have a character called Claudia, who is a very young girl who gets vampirized and is frustrated because she will never age. And it's like, how do you capture that on film? Like, how do you find an actress who can do that? It seems like, that's just not something at the time that you could have filmed, but they found a way to do it. And eventually it wound up being directed by Neil Jordan, who, of course, had won an Oscar for The Crying Game. Really fantastic writer, but he managed to crack it. And he, of course, cast Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise in the leads, which, I mean, you can't really get much more, movie star wattage power than that. Rather famously, Anne Rice was not too thrilled with the casting of Tom Cruise at first. She actually slammed the casting, in the media, but then immediately retracted it when she saw the film and said that he was perfect. But they really, really actually did find a way to get the flavor of the book down. And it's, like I said, I think we were all really surprised when we saw it because it gets that kind of strange, poetic, kind of lyrical quality that story has, and that kind of underlying sense of perversity that goes with it, as well as being very much in the Gothic tradition. Again, it goes all the way back to Gothic literature, Dracula being one of the keystones of those. And but really the ace in the hole, I think, was when they managed to cast a very young Kirsten Dunst as Claudia, who I think is one of the great screen vampires. She's obviously an amazing actress. She's had an incredible career since then as an adult. But there's something very preternaturally captivating about her in this film. And she really, if you've read the book, she is Claudia. They've since made a TV series out of this for AMC, which is interesting. I wouldn't quite put it up there with the Neil Jordan book movie, but I'm curious to see where they go with it from there. Anne Rice, of course, has since passed away, but they are actually developing multiple series out of her books. They also have a Mayfair Witches series going on. But if they keep going with the Interview with the Vampire and all the books that were written since then, I think it's going to be a very interesting path because she wrote all of these books that came in its wake. Vampire Lestat, Queen of the Damned, for example. And of course, Anne Rice eventually found religion and worked that into her books where they become a combination of vampire literature and kind of biblical study. And she sort of overlaps it into the Old Testament and the New Testament, which gets... there's a lot of material to mine in there. It's really fascinating the way that she does it, but how they're going to do that for television, I'm not really sure. But I assume they're going to keep going down that road. But as far as other books go, of course, Let the Right One In, which I mentioned before, is actually based on a book, as was the TV series. A lot of that is truly unfilmable. They did as good a job as they possibly could, but I don't think you could ever do a truly faithful adaptation of it. If you've read it, you know why. But it's some of them are interesting takes. Oddly enough, as I said, Dracula, I don't think it's ever been filmed very faithfully. If you read it, the book is written as it's an epistolary novel. It's written as a series of letters by the various characters in the book, and it has a huge cast of characters. You have all of our central vampire hunters, for example, in London. You have, of course, the ship's log when Dracula's making his way across the ocean, which was actually just turned into a film that played called The Last Voyage of the Demeter. Which I believe is just now hitting streaming and home video, but that's a movie that's based all about that voyage, which is just one little passage of the book. But it's actually fun how people can sort of run with that and sort of go wild to make an entire hour and a half narrative out of that about what happens when you have a vampire loose on this ship, going across the Atlantic Ocean. And I'm honestly surprised it hasn't happened more. There are all other kinds of elements in Dracula that haven't really been expanded all that much or filmed very much, which I'm sure someday they will. But oddly enough, one of the more faithful adaptations in recent years has actually came from Mel Brooks. He did a film called Dracula Dead and Loving It, which right here. which was supposed to be a spoof of Francis Ford Coppola's film Bram Stoker's Dracula, which, despite the title, plays very fast and loose with the source material and introduces this whole, reincarnated romance angle with Winona Ryder's character, and it reinforces the idea that Dracula was based on Vlad Tepes, who was Vlad the Impaler, or who was a real Romanian warlord, and people have assumed that because of the name, which was chosen rather late in the game in the development of the novel, that Stoker was basing it on this person. Not exactly. Uh, there really was nothing about the real man that was worked into it besides his name, but people have really gone nuts with that idea, and that's what Francis Ford Coppola's version went with. That is not in the Mel Brooks one. The Mel Brooks movie actually goes back and kind of tries to film as much of the book as he can in an hour and a half, and if you actually take the jokes out of it, it's pretty darn close. It's one of the closer ones out there. Obviously, he just omits a lot of stuff. But the Blood the Impaler thing was something that was very confusing because it really took off in the 70s. For example, there was a magazine called Famous Monsters of Filmland, which was edited by a guy named Forey Ackerman. And if you were a monster kid, which is basically kids who came of age watching monster movies from, like, say, the 50s onwards, so any of us from the 50s into the 80s or even now, you could call any of us really monster kids. But it was a really big magazine well into the 80s, but they really played this up. I mean, they played up the whole like Dracula being Vlad Tepes thing. If you ever flip to the back of the magazine, they had this ad that they would have in every single issue where it was, oh, you could get some soil from the real Dracula's castle. It was like a little pendant with like a little plastic coffin full of dirt. They probably just scooped it out of, a park in LA, I'm sure. But it was like a little amulet you could wear. So they really played it up like, oh, we went to the real Vlad Tepes castle in Romania, and you could hear, this real soil he might have slept in, and yada yada yada. I mean, totally silly, but whatever. But for some reason, they really loved this. It really took off in the 70s. That was the time people were really into like UFO culture and ESP and all kinds of stuff like that. The paranormal was just so hot, and people were all about spotting Bigfoot. Uh, so it was just the right time for this whole like, oh, Dracula's a real guy thing to really explode. They even made a documentary about it called In Search of Dracula, where we have Christopher Lee going to Romania, and he's like touring you through castles and talking about the history of the real Dracula and all this kind of stuff. Uh, Whatever. But it refuses to die. And like I said, ever since the Francis Ford Coppola version, I think it's with us for good. But anytime someone tells you that Dracula is based on a real person, just take that with not just a grain of salt, but a huge bag of salt. Not really quite the case. But if you've seen Bram Stoker's Dracula, of course, that was another one that really helped sort of reinvent vampire culture for a new generation. That was really one that a lot of Gen Xers, especially millennials, when they were really young and they saw it, it kind of changed again the way they saw vampires. You had Gary Oldman playing Dracula, and unlike a lot of the other vampire adaptations, that's one where they jump on the idea of the vampire sort of changing his appearance a lot over the course of the story. In the book Dracula, it starts off, he's a very old man, and as Jonathan Harker comes, who's a real estate agent in London, he comes to Dracula's castle to take care of his real estate deal in London. And of course, once Dracula starts tasting more and more blood, he gets younger, and of course he can also change into a wolf. He can change into mist, for example, and he can climb upside down castle walls. And that is one thing that Francis Ford Coppola's movie did get, that it starts off with Gary Oldman, of course, in that amazing old age makeup, and he has like the big, hair bun and all that kind of thing, and these incredible costumes, which won an Oscar deservedly. And of course, he winds up getting younger and younger over the course of the movie. And it was really nice to see a movie that did that. There are very, very few that have actually jumped on that idea. There was what was supposed to be a very big adaptation that didn't really take off in 1970 with Christopher Lee. It was made in Spain, called Count Dracula. I'll get to that one in a minute. But for the most part, people sort of ignored that part of the book. That is something that Coppola got right. And so since then, I think at least people sort of got exposed to that idea. And of course, you also see him turn into a big sort of hairy kind of werewolf thing at one point. He changes shape several times over the course of that movie. But it is kind of like the defining one if you got into vampire movies from the 90s onward, and also has a really super overwrite performance by Anthony Hopkins as Van Helsing. You just have to see to believe. He's amazing in it. You also have Keanu Reeves playing Parker, who's amazing in a different way. I think we can safely say he's probably the worst Jonathan Harker in movie history, but it's kind of funny. Now, going back to Christopher Lee, he, for a lot of people, is sort of the definitive Dracula because he played the role more than anybody else. And I covered pretty much all of his versions of Dracula in this book. He, of course, in 1958, he appeared in The Horror of Dracula, which was really the first major color vampire film. And it's great. It is supposedly based on Bram Stoker's book, doesn't really have a whole lot to do with it aside from some character names. It's only 80 minutes long and it's super streamlined and stuff is shifted around. But it's a great movie and it was a huge hit. And at the time, it was really scandalous because, you had like this bright red blood, which was something people didn't really normally see in vampire movies. And it even got censored a little bit. We didn't see the full cut until maybe like about 8 years ago. They found all the footage because Dracula at the end when he decomposes into dust after this amazing fight scene, but he gets thrown into the sunlight. But the censors like freaked out and they made them cut most of it out because it was too strong. But now we have the full strength version. Uh, but that was just such a huge hit internationally. And Christopher Lee, despite the fact he's only in the movie for maybe like 7 minutes. I mean, he's all over the posters, but he's really barely in it. And that was the case for a lot of his later vampire movies, and why he started to get really annoyed because he had very little dialogue and he didn't have a ton of screen time. He mostly would just stand around and, just sort of look imposing. And occasionally he would just, like bite a person's neck. And that was kind of it. So you had him pop up in things like Dracula, Prince of Darkness, Taste the Blood of Dracula. One that got a lot of flack when it first came out was Dracula AD 1972, which found a way to have Dracula stuffed into a church for a century, and he winds up being revived through this occult ceremony in 1972, swinging London, which is actually better than you would think it is. People have come around, and it's a bit of a cult classic now. It's a lot of fun. But at the time, the idea of dropping Dracula into 70s London was like, what are you doing? It's crazy. But he really kind of rode that train out. But he would always say that he wasn't happy with the scripts. But he did manage to get a role playing Dracula in the Spanish production, which again, it follows the book about as well as it could, considering that they had a lot of budgetary problems. But it is a great one if you want to see Christopher Lee kind of tackle the role seriously. But he actually played vampires in other movies as well. He has a cameo, for example, as a vampire in a really nutty British comedy called The Magic Christian, based on a Terry Southern book, which is one of like the craziest movies of the late 60s. If you haven't seen it, it just has this just awesome soundtrack by Badfinger, and just go see it. It's wild. But there's a great bit with Christopher Lee where he gets loose on a yacht and he's running up and down the hallways in full Dracula gear. He also appeared in an Italian comedy called Uncle was a Vampire, where he winds up getting revived in a modern Italian hotel. And it's just totally played for goofs. It's a really, really kind of like silly comedy. It's just gotten a full-on restoration. It's out on DVD, streaming, Blu-ray. But if you want to see Christopher Lee just really kicking back and having fun, I would say check that one out as well. Now, as far as female vampires go, again, we've had tons of them over the years. Obviously, France, believe it or not, has had a major cottage industry. There was a director named Jean Rollin who, at the time in the 70s and 80s, his movies were kind of considered garbage. They got released to drive-ins. They weren't very respected, but now they're considered like high art films. But he did a whole string of films about yes, Girl Walks Home Alone. Girl Walks Home Alone at Night is fantastic, by the way. Saw the comment there. That's a great one. But John Rollin was an artist. He was sort of an avant-garde comic book artist, and he brought the sensibility to his vampire movies, where they're not really scary, but they're just sort of poetic, and they have kind of a strange sense of humor. They would often have these kind of like weird sort of avant-garde rock soundtracks. But his movies are considered like major milestones of world cinema now, which is a far cry from when they first came out. But he did things like Requiem for a Vampire, Lips of Blood, for example, things like that. And in the 70s, it's also when you started to see other genres sort of cross-pollinating with vampirism. Obviously, one of the big hits, and I think a movie that shocked a lot of people when it came out because it actually is great, is Blackula, which is a title that when they first announced the movie, people were like, what? Because so-called blaxploitation was quite a rage. Obviously, Shaft was a huge film, including its iconic Isaac Hayes theme song. You had Pam Grier, of course, was taking off in things like Foxy Brown and Coffee. So why not make a real bona fide black vampire movie? Well, their master stroke with that film was they managed to cast an actor named William Marshall, who was a brilliant Shakespearean actor. That he was very experienced on the stage, to play an African prince who has been turned into a vampire by Dracula. Not of his own free will. And so he's actually a very sort of sympathetic vampire, and he is let loose in modern LA. But it is such an amazing performance that you would think that something called Blackula would be played out for camp value, but it's actually not. He takes it very seriously, and that's why it absolutely works. But it's a film that when everyone sees, they're always kind of surprised at how really effective it is and how great his performance is. And it's actually a shame that William Marshall never became a bigger star, because he really was an incredible actor. He did make a sequel though. It's called Scream Black. Excuse me, Scream Blackula Scream, where he's pitted against Pam Grier, who plays this occult priestess. And so it turns into a battle of wills between them. Not a bad film, but the original Blackula is the best, and I think actually one of the strongest vampire films of the 70s. Also, you have what I would call Jean Rollin sort of touches on this, but you also have the vampire art film, where you have European directors who sort of tackle it in a way that's a little outside what you would normally expect. For my money, one of the best vampire films ever made is called Daughters of Darkness, which is a Belgian film made in the 70s. And what they did with that was they kind of take the story of Elizabeth Báthory, or Elizabeth Báthory, who is a real Hungarian countess who, so the legend goes, she thought that she could be eternally young by bathing in the blood of young virginal women. There are different theories about that. Some say that was just a nasty rumor started by her political opponents. The whole story, it really conflicts depending on which source you're looking at. But the gist of it is that for one reason or another, for her crime, she wound up being locked up in her castle and bricked up and just, fed through a hole. And that's how she lived the rest of her life. That she's since sort of become kind of an honorary vampire because of that, even though she didn't actually drink blood, but she's sort of vampire-ish. So the idea with this film is they cast one of the great actresses of the 70s, Delphine Seyrig, who was in really prestigious films like Last Year at Marienbad, Day of the Jackal. They cast her as Elizabeth Báthory, who is now in modern-day Belgium, staying at this off-season resort. And she, her eye is caught by this young couple, and you can't decide which one of them is she trying to turn into a vampire, which one is she trying to seduce. The film plays a lot with that. But it's very surrealistic. It's very beautifully mounted. It's by a great director named Harry Kumel, who's, again, one of the sort of the great Belgian avant-garde directors. One of the great touches of the film, though, is that they modeled her after Marlene Dietrich. Her hairstyle, her costumes, everything is modeled after Marlene Dietrich, who, honestly, if you're going to be a vampire for all eternity, like, that's, wouldn't you want to be Marlene Dietrich? That'd just be awesome. And that's kind of the wish fulfillment of vampirism. Like I said, as I mentioned before, that it was something where it went from being sort of a fearful, disgusting pestilence, sort of the Salem's Lot version of the vampire, into the sexy, alluring vampire. And for my money, I think she's probably the most alluring of all vampires. If you can see the film again, it's streaming on Amazon Prime, everywhere like that. But it's a delightful film. It's actually very funny and very stylish, very witty, and creepy, and very, very sexy. And it's tons of fun. I'm sure whenever I talk about this book, people always ask, like, what's your favorite vampire film of all time? And that's a really tough one, because it's easier if you sort of break it down by country or by decade. I've already named some. Near Dark, Daughters of Darkness, Let's Write One In, obviously Horror Dracula. But it kind of depends on your mood, because, again, there are just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these. And like I said, as many as I picked for this book, a lot didn't even make the cut, and some have even come out since then, which is crazy. For example, we just had one very more recently called Day Shift with Jamie Foxx, for example, which is kind of like a sort of semi-comic LA take on it. And we've got plenty more coming up. They never stop. And it is interesting because there are also kind of offbeat ones that don't get a lot of love, that I think, for one reason or another, one has been out of circulation in the US for a long time, that I think is one of the all-time great films, is one called Martin, which was made in 1977 by 76, by George Romero, who is, of course, in the horror history books. He directed Night of the Living Dead, which is, the zombie movie that everyone has been copying ever since then. There would be no Walking Dead without him, for example. But he did take one stab at the vampire story, and it was shot on his home turf of Pittsburgh. And the gist of it is that it follows this teenager named Martin, who has gone to live with his cousin, his much older cousin, who tells him that, okay, you're a vampire. I know you're a vampire. If you feed on anybody in the neighborhood, I'm going to run a stake through your heart. But the film never quite lets you know if he's a vampire or not. It kind of plays around, like he has these flashbacks that are in black and white, with candelabra, where you think, oh, maybe he was a vampire in Europe. But you don't really know. What we do know is that he does kill people, that he sort of slips out and he will, like, feed on people's blood. And it's all about you don't know whether it's supernatural or not. And even at the end of the movie, it's a little bit ambiguous, but it is so incredibly well done, and it has a lot of fun playing around with vampire ideas. Because the people that he lived, that, for example, his cousin and his daughter, they have this tension because she really wants to take him under her wing. She just thinks that he's psychologically damaged, and doesn't believe any of this stuff. And so, on top of that, he also calls into a radio show and talks about what it's like being a modern vampire and sort of debunking all the myths about it and things like that. So it's almost, this of course, was at a time when, call-in radio culture was huge. Like guys like Wolfman Jack, for example, who were ruling the airwaves. And this film really has takes a lot of pleasure in sort of goofing on that. Like, what would happen if a real vampire did call into a radio show and started sort of letting it loose, like all of his experiences about it, saying, well, this is right, this isn't right, and so on and so forth. He just calls himself the Count. But it's a film that, because of various legal issues, it hasn't been out of here. It is out in Britain and other countries, for example. But if you have the chance, I would say check out Martin, because it is one that is very much aware of its history, both literary and cinematic, and is worth checking out. Now, also, of course, I mentioned Blackula, but another film that's worth mentioning on a much more serious note from the African American perspective is one called Ganja and Hess, which was considered to be actually a lost film for quite a long period of time. This was a very serious take on vampirism as sort of a disease that had spread from Africa, that it was something that could, if you were sort of cut with a sacrificial dagger that an African tribe had, that it was something that could be spread. It was directed by a guy named Bill Gunn, who was a very serious, he was an African-American filmmaker who wanted to make, very serious art films. And this was his way of doing it, that he managed to make it about this anthropologist who winds up getting infected. It spreads to his wife, but it's not entirely a negative thing, that it's almost kind of like a reawakening, that they start to sort of be aware, that it also makes them aware of their history and their heritage and their culture. Unfortunately, this was a little too much at the time it came out for people to really handle. It wasn't quite artsy enough to play, at the Cannes Film Festival, but it wasn't really enough of an exploitation film to play at the drive-in. And so what they did was they cut about 40 minutes out of the movie. They reshuffled stuff around. They wound up giving it different titles, stuff like Blood Couple. That's hard to say 5 times fast. Double Possession, all these really trashy titles, and they tried to turn it into an exploitation film. And for a long time, we thought that the original version of this film was gone, but it was eventually restored, and now it's by the Museum of Modern Art. It's played around the world at major festivals, but it's that's now considered to be like a real keystone of vampire cinema, especially in the evolution of African American vampire cinema. And I just saw someone commented that they really like Blade. Blade is great as well. That, of course, most people have forgotten this, but Blade, the one with Wesley Snipes, that's really kind of the first modern Marvel movie. I know we think that Iron Man with Robert Downey Jr. was it, but really Blade was actually before that. Blade was a half vampire, half human character who premiered in Marvel. He was really big. He started off in the 70s. He would cross over with lots of other characters. Marvel had its own version of Dracula that you interact with, and it took a while, but they actually made the first Blade movie in the 90s. And Blade became actually a trilogy of films with Wesley Snipes. The first one is my personal favorite, although a lot of people like the second one with Guillermo del Toro, which is interesting. I don't think it's quite to that level. I kind of prefer the first one, but whatever. You can take your pick between the first two movies. The third one, let's just not talk about it. But it is interesting how when you sort of have Black characters who are vampires, obviously that kind of changes the tenor of it, because that, if it's an American vampire, that has a certain kind of symbolic quality to it. Whereas if it's one who comes from Africa, of course, that's a little bit different as well. And then of course you have LGBT vampires, and there's all kinds of ways people have been sort of playing around with the idea of it over the past few decades. Of course, Marvel being Marvel, now that Marvel is now its own sort of juggernaut in the culture, they've been trying to get a new version of Blade off the ground. It's been stop, start. It was supposed to be shooting actually when the book came out. Because of COVID, it wound up getting sort of sidelined. But as of right now, it still is supposed to star Mahershala Ali, who is the 2-time Oscar winner for Moonlight and Green Book, which I think it's going to be fascinating to see what happens if that gets done. I really hope that it does. I know Blade has been sort of a jinxed project, but we'll see. Marvel's been having a lot of speed bumps lately, but who knows? Has a movie ever been done with a whole family of vampires? In a sense, yes. Well, actually, I think Near Dark, in a sense, is sort of about a family of vampires who are roaming the desert. I I don't think they've done one where it's like a whole like husband, wife, daughter, daughter, son kind of thing that much. Not really. I mean, you think they would have. Something I always wondered about, one of the most beloved vampires is on the Munsters. You have Grandpa, for example, who is modeled after Lugosi. He's got, the Lugosi medallion and the widow's peak and all that stuff. But that's a weird one because like everybody in that family is a different oh yeah, what we do in the shadows is roommates. Yeah. Twilight, sort of, kind of. Um, but yeah, but I was always wondered in the monsters though. It's like, so how do you go from vampires and then you got a Frankenstein's monster and then you've got Lily who's kind of a vampire? And then you have like the werewolf son. Yeah, I don't know. That show opens up a whole bunch of questions I never really answered, but let's not dwell too much. Uh, okay, so we've hit the 45-minute mark. I believe we're now going to officially open the forum up to questions. If you have any, go ahead and fire away. Um, so yeah, so you mentioned what we do in the shadows, which I think is one of the very greatest vampire films in probably the last 20 years, which is, if you haven't seen it, it's a mockumentary comedy about taking place in New Zealand about a household of vampire roommates. And eventually their rivalry with like the werewolves nearby kind of kicks in, and what happens when a new vampire initiate winds up coming under their roof. But it is hysterically funny, and of course launched a TV series that is on FX. It's also on Hulu streaming, which might actually be even better. It takes place in the same universe, but it takes place in Staten Island, and it is absolutely hysterical. But just a really, really wonderful show. Yes, the Radleys should be filmed. Absolutely. Oh, yeah, there is actually one. The Hamiltons. I forgot about that. The Hamiltons is actually one out there. That played as part of, there was a little, for a few years, we had this kind of great unofficial festival that Rob Zombie and some other folks kicked off. And that was one of them where they actually played them in theaters as part of like a horror fest every year. But the Hamiltons is a great one, which you can find streaming as well. What is the key to making a new Dracula movie that connects with audiences? Or do you have another book adaptation or a more modernized version or something else? Yeah, it was a shame that that last voyage of the Demeter bombed, although I think part of it was probably that title because nobody could say it. I think they saw it and people just kind of got put off at the box office. It's too bad. Renfield, I thought it was so close. I really enjoyed Renfield a lot. I think there's the cop stuff, I think kind of bogged down a little bit. It's got a little schizophrenic, but I think what works in it really works. I think Nicholas Hoult is fantastic as Renfield. It's about him being in the modern day, working, being Dracula's servant and sort of bucking against that. It's worth seeing. I think it's a really good shot, but it's too bad because they were both really hard films to market. I think the key to making a new vampire film that connects with people, it has a Dracula tie to it. Um, I think you just have to find a part of it that resonates with people. I think if you've read the book, for example, there's the character of Lucy, who is Mina's best friend, who becomes a vampire. She winds up becoming sort of a night prowler. She becomes known as the Bloofer Lady. I don't know why they haven't done that in modern day. I think that would actually make a really great movie. So if anyone out there is a screenwriter, please make a modern day Lucy movie. I think that would actually be really cool. And I think it actually might connect with people. I don't know why it hasn't happened. Fright Night is great. I do love the original Fright Night, and the remake that they did is actually not bad. It's pretty good. I was sorry they got rid of the Roddy McDowell horror host character in the remake. They made him in sort of like a David Blaine character, which that was kind of dicey. But Colin Farrell is actually a really fantastic vampire in that. I think both Fright Nights are really good. Fright Night Part 2, which came out at the end of the 80s, is one of those movies that's stuck in limbo, but it's actually really good. Just almost impossible to see right now. Let's see. Yeah, the BBC, yes, they did. The BBC did was as Mark Gatiss, for example, wrote a new version of Dracula. It was like a 3-part miniseries, and they had Lucy as kind of like an Instagram influencer, which is funny. She's not the focus of it, but she's in the 3rd episode. So they do a little bit of that. But they don't really do the Bloofer Lady thing like to the hilt. Like I wish they would just do just the Lucy story and just kind of go nuts with it. Would be great. But yes, you're right. They do the Lucy modern day thing a little bit in there. If you've seen the new Dracula 3-parter, it's the BBC did it, but it's on Netflix over here. It is so interesting. I don't think it entirely works. Again, I think the 3rd installment has a ton of issues in it, but they did try something different. So hats off for that. Yeah, I think Keanu is definitely the worst Harker. I don't think anybody else could do worse. He has a line reading in that one where Gary Oldman is after me and he goes, "You're a fiend, sir." It's just terrible. But the worst Dracula, yeah, Dominic Purcell, I would say, is definitely one of the weaker ones. I don't know. We haven't had too many really terrible ones, actually. I think that's a role that most people haven't really screwed up too badly. Um, we've had a lot of underrated Draculas. Louis Jourdan, for example, did a great one that was on PBS. They reran it all the time at Halloween for a long time when I was a kid. There's a Louis Jourdan miniseries of Dracula that is really, really great and really scary. Um, but yeah, now you got me thinking of bad Draculas. I don't know. Well, Die Hard Dracula, if you haven't seen it, that's probably the worst one ever. Dark Shadows is, of course, part of the long tradition of TV vampires. That was the one that really that was a really fun example because if you don't recall, Dark Shadows was a mini series. Originally, it was kind of like a Jane Eyre style soap opera that ran every single day, and it wasn't until they were pretty far into it, actually. I mean, they were a good uh, basically like 2 years in before they suddenly. Oh, Dracula versus Frankenstein. He's so fun though. Kind of fun. Um, but then they decided that they would bring in a vampire all of a sudden and go full on supernatural. And so they introduced Barnabas Collins, played by Jonathan Frid, and the ratings just suddenly went through the roof. And for the first time, kids were watching a soap opera. Like the kids like just fell in love with Barnabas and they would run home from school and watch Dark Shadows. And so then they started introducing ghosts and all their kinds of stuff. And it just went totally monster crazy. And really Dark Shadows was a big part of where we had this sort of romanticized vampire thing because Barnabas was really evil when he started off, and he got much more sympathetic that he was actually had this whole backstory, with this witch named Angelique, who had cursed him and all this stuff. They built this whole lore about him, and so that version of the vampire, I think, really had a lot to do with how we saw him later on. You mentioned Buffy the Vampire Slayer, for example, which takes a lot from Dark Shadows. You have the characters of Angel, for example. And Spike, who are very much in the Barnabas Collins tradition, where they are guys who are sort of, been sort of cursed against their will, and they're these tragic vampire figures, and they have their love interests. They both have their sort of own kind of love stories with Buffy, for example. Uh, but um, but I think Buffy, of course, is definitely like one of the many successes we've had from Dark Shadows. What do you think of the Dracula 2000 idea that Dracula was Judas? I love that idea. I wish they had actually done more with it. Like, so the movie was nothing special, but that is such a cool idea that you find out that he was actually, that Judas Iscariot had been cursed and actually turned into that. It's a really neat idea. Uh, yeah, it's unfortunately, yeah, when it came out, it's very much a product of its time. But yeah, it was a really cool concept that I wish they had done more with. If you've seen the show Supernatural, they kind of deal with that idea as well, where you find out that some of the monsters that supernatural figures like that have their own past, where they actually are, for example, fallen angels, archangels, that kind of thing. They play with the whole lore of that, going all the way back to the Bible. There's a lot of material to be mined with that if you do it really well. Um, let's see. I'm sure I missed a few questions here. Just watched The Addiction. It was kind of like a French New Wave vampire movie by an American NYC. Yeah, The Addiction is part of a wave. There was a kind of a curious subset in the 90s when indie films were taking off. That was kind of like when Miramax was going crazy. Um, but yeah, The Addiction was made by a director named Abel Ferrara, who was one of the great indie New York directors. And it kind of does the parallel of vampirism being like drug addiction. Obviously, if you are someone who feeds off of blood, the parallels between someone who's addicted to heroin obviously kind of writes itself. But this is shot in black and white. It's very gritty, but it feels like a vampire being portrayed as something like a junkie who has to go prowling back alleyways. In this case, it's a female vampire played by Lily Taylor. Really fascinating one. And there was this whole like kind of little mini period of sort of, I'd almost call them like heroin chic vampire movies. There was one called Naja, for example, that was presented by David Lynch. But yeah, really, really kind of interesting sort of little subset. But The Addiction is one of the very best of those. Let's see. Let's see. Only Lovers Left Alive. Yeah, the Jarmusch film is a really solid one. Tilda Swinton as a vampire. How could you not resist that? If anybody was ever born to play a vampire, it's got to be her. But yeah, it also kind of sets it within kind of the rock star kind of backdrop, which is something vampirism has always, been prone to. Again, Anne Rice was really kind of started that off when she did the vampire Lestat, where she thought if Lestat is sort of like one of the main threads of her books. And of course, if he was in the modern day, of course he'd want to become a rock star. Why not? Because we looked at someone like David Bowie, almost kind of seemed like a vampire or like an alien. He played up the whole thing. That whole Ziggy Stardust thing. I mean, that kind of feels like a vampire. So Anne Rice really ran with it. But Only Lovers Left Alive is kind of like the next step in that it's sort of this dark rock star love story, you might say. Any other needle as fangs like addiction and girl walks home alone? Well, I would actually, well, Martin, the one that I mentioned, kind of plays around with that. Um, where it's razor blades, but it plays very much like a drug addiction story as well. The Hunger also plays with that, where it is the vamp, where especially when David Bowie starts to age, he becomes sort of like a drug addict trying to get his fix. There's a scene where he's actually like walking down the street, he's kind of getting the shakes because he's getting older, and he clumsily tries to he attacks a guy who's on roller skates. He tries to slice him, just trying to get his fix. But it kind of plays with that as well. Think of any other ones, I'm sure. And then of course, somebody had mentioned Twilight in there, which is sort of like the glammed up version of the vampire story. And it's Twilight is sort of like a whole topic unto itself. I mean, there've already been like tons and tons of papers written about the whole Twilight series, which is like just a huge blurry phenomenon. It's sort of like the Harry Potter of vampire fiction. But of course, they wound up making the movies out of it, which it sort of plays up the whole teen vampire thing, but also in a way it plays with the whole addiction idea, and that you have the idea of this very old vampire who looks like a teenager going into high school and falls for this girl, but he's sort of trying to lure her in. And it kind of, not only obviously there's sort of the predatory aspects of that, which again people have been you know digging through that ever since those books came out, but there's also, it's kind of like the guy trying to get a kid hooked on drugs. It does have a little bit of that as well. Going back to Midnight Mass, yes, Mike Flanagan is most definitely um uh he's a huge Stephen King guy. He's shot several Stephen King stories. He's the guy who wrote and directed Midnight Mass. And he has this great sort of repertory of players that he uses in all of his films. For example, Henry Thomas from E.T., he casts in all of his stuff. But the gist of it is that it fuses vampirism with Catholicism, that a priest who has been gone winds up coming back. But he's becomes an old priest, comes back to this island to his parishioners, but he's becomes incredibly young. Nobody recognizes him, so he passes himself off as a new priest, and he thinks that he is sort of spreading a gift to all of his parishioners, but it's actually vampirism, and it comes at a very high price. But Mike Flanagan, actually, he also did kind of another vampire story, and again, this is one of those kind of in between ones, which is Doctor Sleep, based on the Stephen King book, which is about a group called the Knot, who are sort of psychic vampires. But Mike Flanagan made a really solid film out of that as well. If you can, I would suggest watching his director's cut, because it is really, really good. He finds a way of fusing it was written as a sequel to The Shining, and he finds a way of merging Stephen King's The Shining with the movie. And if you might remember, Stephen King hated the movie, the Stanley Kubrick film. He really despised it. But Flanagan found a way of threading that very, very delicate needle where it actually is a sequel to the book and the movie, with a bit of vampire sort of elements kind of thrown into it as well. But as far as yeah, and there's a new Salem's Lot that's been in the can for a while. I don't know why they keep pushing it back, but hopefully it'll come out someday. But that would be the third version of it. But as far as any other Stephen King vampire stories I'd love to see on film, there is a great Stephen King vampire story called Jerusalem's Lot, which is kind of it's like a little side sequel in a way to Salem's Lot, which hasn't exactly been filmed, and I don't know why. I would think that maybe for something like the Creepshow series they would do it. It could make a really good half-hour short, but they haven't really done it yet, and I'm not really sure why. He also wrote some other little tangential bit of Salem's Lot fiction, other little stories. There's a limited edition that was reissue of Salem's Lot that came out that actually had some of that in it, where they have all the sort of the ephemera from Salem's Lot, little short stories, little projected afterwards, things like that. So he's kind of built his own Salem's Lot lore. So I think after they do the Salem's Lot movie that comes out, I'd love to see someone do like a real sort of mini series that kind of runs through all these ideas that run through it, because there's so many characters and so many directions you could run through with it. It would be really great. But yeah, I agree. The Night Flyer is a great Stephen King based vampire movie that not many folks have seen. It's been out of commission on home video for a long time. It was made by HBO, and for some reason they've been sitting on it. I don't know why it's not playing on Max, or it's not on, it's just impossible to see right now. I don't know why it's not streaming, but it's a really great one, which is it's about a little passenger flyer plane being piloted by a vampire who goes around. It's like a little pedal jumper, and he goes around to these little airports, and he uses that as the means to feed on people. And it's a really cool idea. It has a really scary looking vampire, but there's this very sort of corrupt reporter who's on who winds up having his path crossed with this vampire. But it's a really cool idea, and it actually is, I think, one of the more underrated vampire movies out there. I definitely agree on that one as well. Um, yeah, I'm trying to think of other Stephen King vampire stories that are out there. But I think, yeah, it is on YouTube, really? Oh, someone must have pirated it. Well, yeah, if it is, go watch it. It's great. Someone probably ripped their DVD and stuck it up there. Because yeah, it is definitely worth checking out. It's a really cool one. I cherish my DVD of it because that thing's been out of print for like 15 years, I think. Um, but it's a really, really great one as well. Uh, let's see, what other Stephen King ones are there? I don't know. Anyway, but yeah, but if you haven't, I would say check out Mike Flanagan's other stuff. I don't know if it looks like he's actually working a little bit of vampirism into his version of The Fall of the House of Usher, which, as I said, it drops tomorrow on Netflix, but it's kind of his new take on the Edgar Allan Poe story. But if you've seen the previews, it's a long way from Poe. It's modern day, and it turns it upside down. It looks like he's actually working a little bit of that in there as well. Can't say for sure until we all see it, but uh, yeah, if you have the link for the night flyer, definitely drop it in there because I think folks would really get a kick out of that one as well. And of course, there's also a lot of vampire books that no one has actually shot yet. As you mentioned, there's some Stephen King stuff, but there are a lot of authors out there who have written books about vampires that I think are really solid. One of my very favorites is an author named Poppy Z. Bright, who wrote some really interesting kind of things in sort of the Anne Rice tradition, but much more for the 90s generation. There's one called Drawing Blood, for example, that's really, really good. But nobody's filmed those, and I don't know why that is. Maybe it's just I don't know if Poppy doesn't want the books to be filmed or what, but there are a lot of other books out there that are just properties ripe to be picked up. Thank you for the link there. Uh, but yeah, so if if you are a horror fiction fan, for example, it's worth roaming around through there because we've definitely not finished exploiting every aspect of vampirism that could be done on screen or in print. And I really think that if people were more adventurous and stepped outside of their safety area, and there are lots of books out there that I think would make great films that people would love to see. Because right now, again, like I said, we've revived properties like Let the Right One In, for example. We've had one remake, we've had a TV show. The original is still the best, although the remake, which is called Let Me In, is actually not bad. It's actually pretty good. Directed by a guy named Matt Reeves, who did the last three Planet of the Apes films. But that's a pretty cool story as well. But it's like there's this franchise mentality that has to be something pre-sold for the audience. It has to be a little pre-digested, which is too bad. But again, hopefully, maybe companies like A24 out there, who are like one of the great indie companies right now, they'll take a chance and maybe start getting us some more original vampire movies or adapting some of these books that are lying out there because there's just such a wealth of stuff left to uncover. Anybody else have any questions?
Oh, I was just going to ask, have you heard of you're talking about the origins of Dracula, and have you heard about Mercy Brown, the vamp? She was, it was in the tuberculosis days, and they like dug her up, and they thought she was a vampire,
Oh,
sapping
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
I read that she might have been seen by that news story might have been seen by Bram Stoker, and it might have been the basis for Lucy.
Yeah.
But
Quite possibly, yeah. And that ties because there was a whole like fear back then because of course obviously you had things like TB and you had all these diseases where people they weren't really sure people were dead. First of all, forensics weren't quite what they are now. But yeah, Mercy Brown is a good example of where someone being exhumed and where they actually thought that, oh, someone came back from the dead. That's also around the same time that we actually had the phrase dead ringer, which if you know the origin of that, you would actually like have a bell put in your coffin or in your mausoleum that you would actually be able to, if you woke up and you're like, oh crap, someone buried me, that you'd like be able to reach out and go, ding, 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 somebody come dig me up or unlock the mausoleum and let me out. Because that was a real problem back then.
yeah,
People could go into like cataleptic states or they could have a disease that would like stop their life functions for a long period of time. And if your body heals, then you don't want to wake up in a coffin and be like, oh crap, people are gonna, and that's kind of how the whole vampire thing started because that was a real fear that people had that somebody could come crawling out of a grave in the middle of the night and suddenly it's like, oh, there's your uncle standing outside your window. It's like, ah, Jesus, Um,
hmm. Yeah. I just saw Roger Corman's Premature Burial, which was
yeah, exactly.
of course
Yeah,
read about that. Very
yeah,
fun movie, but
yeah. That's a really, really fun one. Uh, any good Japanese vampire movies? Yeah, there's actually a lot of them. Japan. Well, so Hammer's Horror of Dracula was a massive hit in Japan, like huge. like from the late 50s to early 60s. It was playing constantly. And so there were a lot of Japanese filmmakers who wanted to make their own version of that. And so there was actually like a whole, for a while, like into the early 70s, they made their own kind of like Hammer style movies, but there are some really cool ones. There's one called Evil of Dracula, and there's Lake of Dracula, and there's one called Bloodthirsty Doll. And they're really great because they have sort of a Hammer vibe, but they take place in Japan. But they're super fun. You can find them. They're streaming all over the place. They're on Blu-ray. Um, they're really great. But yeah, if you want to see some good Japanese vampire films, I would say start with that. Maybe start off with Evil of Dracula. That's a really, really excellent one. I have not written my own vampire fiction. I have written some various screenplays and I've actually helped out on some scripts. But I've only actually just written like thrillers. I go with suspense stuff. I would love to write a vampire story at some point. Maybe someday, who knows? But, if a certain idea hits me, maybe it'll happen. But yeah, not yet. But yeah, after watching officially 200 vampire movies and throw another 100 on top of that again and writing about them for 2 years, yeah, I kind of had my fill for a little bit, but maybe now's the time to jump into it and write something original on my own. You never know.
And I was just going to ask, do you have a favorite portrayal of Dracula?
Her portrayal. Well, like I said, I think Louis Jourdan's version in the late 70s, I think, is one of them. I think if ever there was a guy born to play Dracula, it's got to be him because he just has this great kind of silky voice and he's got the look. I mean, he's got the eyebrows. I mean, um, he was definitely like meant to play Dracula for sure. And I think he's one of the very, very best. Um, like I said, I've always been really partial of at first bite. I don't know why, but just like George Hamilton to me just makes a great Dracula. Like when you just see him in the full getup and with the accent and everything, it's like, of course, like it just seems like it was meant to happen. Um, and I do really like what Gary Oldman brought to the part. It's so radically different from what we had seen before then. But he has so much fun with it. I mean, he just really like, you know, obviously bites into the role, but he just really chews the scenery up with that one. He has so much fun with the makeup and of course that laugh, which was like the big selling point. You saw the trailer before it even came out. Gary just throwing his head back and he's a really fun Dracula as well. So it's probably kind of like a tie between those three, I think.
Hmm.
I should say Bela Lugosi, but like it's like he was always there like my entire life, and he's just sort of ingrained. So it's like it kind of goes without saying. Like, I mean,
Hmm.
he was the original. He's always kind of going to be to the top of the heap.
Yeah, I rewatched Dracula recently, and I mean he's amazing, and just the screen presence
Yeah,
and
yeah,
not like I thought there'd be very over the top, but it's kind of, I don't know, more understated maybe.
it is. And Dracula is an interesting one because again, it's a movie that I saw. Well, when I was like a little kid growing up, it was like you could only like you have to rent the VHS, or you'd see it on TV or whatever. And I thought I knew the movie really well, and I think maybe like 15, 20 years ago, I think when they did the full restoration on it and over at the Academy, they ran it there in the theater on a huge screen with an audience. So sitting watching that movie like on a big screen with like 150 other people, it's a completely different film. It's wild. It's really spooky and creepy. It just has because people who watched it on TV, they're like, oh, it's kind of slow and stage bound and talking yada yada. But it's like, but it's not on the big screen. It just has this weird vibe to it. But you need to watch it with other people around you to really get it. Just watching it on TV, it's not the same movie at all.
Hmm.
Also worth mentioning, if I know a lot of people may be aware of this, but when Bela Lugosi made his version, and of course he had originated that on stage, he already played the role like hundreds of times by the time they shot the movie, so he really knew it inside and out. But at the same time, something that was kind of a common practice was studios would shoot the same movie twice in different languages, but they shot a Spanish version of Dracula with a Mexican cast on the same sets at night. So like when they would break for the day, Todd Browning, Bela, all them, they would go home, and then like the Spanish crew would come in and they would shoot their version. And it's amazing. It was actually thought to be lost until like around the 80s. They finally found a print of it. But it's phenomenal. And what's weird is it's like half an hour longer, and they actually shot a lot of stuff that's not in the Lugosi one. They actually shoot the full ship voyage across the ocean to London, and it's really scary, like the way they do it. I mean, you have they show him attacking guys like screaming, clawing at the glass at the porthole and stuff like that. Um, So you kind of have to watch both versions. If you haven't seen the Spanish one, I would say definitely check it out.
Um, don't see any more questions.
I think I hit all the questions. I hope I was scrolling through here. I think
Oh, I got one more.
I did.
Oh,
Oh, thank you,
sure.
Jerome.
Thank you, Chris.
Um, yeah. So, but again, thank you so much for having me on. This has been a lot of fun. And again, I'm glad you had me on for Halloween. I'm basically once October 1st hits, I'm already getting in the mood. So you got me at the right time because like October is just nonstop Halloween for me. Just like 31 days of just nonstop fun. It's like I try to watch a horror movie or read horror fiction. It's just it's just a month for it. Even here in LA where I am right now, our fall isn't quite as great as it is where you are, but we don't really get the leaves turning. Kind of quite get the same vibe, but close enough. But yeah, I appreciate you having me on so much, and I hope you're having some more kind of Halloween friendly folks coming on to talk because yeah, this is really the best time of year for it.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was great, a lot of fun. And please check out Nathaniel's book. We have I think we have at least one copy at the library, and of course, it's available wherever books are sold. And on that note of upcoming events, we do have on October 26th, we're going to have classic horror stories with Edward French. He's going to read a story by Lovecraft and the waxwork by uh, another classic. The author is escaping me at this point, but that's going to be on the 26th at 7 p.m. So please check our social media for that. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thanks again, Nathaniel.
Thank you.
Have a great night. Have a
Thank you.
great Halloween season.
Good evening.